The day Emma Leland stepped off the stagecoach in Caldwell, Kansas, a man she had never met leaned against the post office wall and told her, with a wide yellow grin, that the frontier would swallow her whole before winter arrived. That was the first thing anyone said to her in the territory, and it settled into her chest like a stone dropped into still water, rippling outward until she could feel the tremors in her fingertips. She stood in the dust of the main street with a single trunk behind her, a leather satchel over her shoulder, and the kind of posture that women from Hartford, Connecticut learned early and kept forever, spine straight and chin lifted, as though the world could not touch what it could not reach. She was 23 years old. She had crossed 6 states by rail and 2 more by coach. Her hands were calloused now where they had once been soft, and her copper-brown hair had come half loose from its pins somewhere around the Missouri border. The man with the yellow grin spat tobacco into the dirt and walked away, apparently satisfied that he had done his civic duty by welcoming her to the frontier. Emma did not cry. She had made a firm agreement with herself somewhere around St. Louis that she would not allow herself that particular luxury until she was alone and behind a locked door. She picked up the handle of her trunk, found it too heavy to drag more than a foot, and stood there surveying the street with dark green eyes that missed very little. It was June of 1880, and Caldwell sat right on the edge of the Kansas-Indian Territory line, which made it both one of the most important cattle towns in the state and one of the most honest advertisements for what men could do to a place when left largely unsupervised. The street was wide enough for 3 wagons abreast and rutted deeply by the passage of thousands of longhorns driven up the Kishom Trail every spring. The buildings on either side were a mixture of timber frames, false fronts painted in fading optimism, and a few newer structures in red brick that suggested someone believed the town might actually last. There were saloons and a general store and a land office, and a church with a bell that looked as though it had been borrowed from somewhere grander and never returned. There was also a boarding house, which was where Emma was supposed to be going. She had come to Caldwell because she had answered an advertisement placed in a Hartford newspaper by a man named Thomas Aldridge, who claimed to need a schoolteacher for the newly established Caldwell District School. The advertisement had described the position as an opportunity for an educated woman of independent character to make a genuine contribution to the civilizing of the western frontier. Emma had found this description both flattering and slightly ominous, which she took as a sign that it was probably honest. She had not come because anyone had encouraged her. Her mother had wept. Her father, 3 years dead, had believed firmly in the value of staying put. Her older sister Caroline had declared that Emma had always been too headstrong for her own good and that the West would prove it. The minister of their church had prayed publicly for her safe return, which had the effect of making the departure feel rather more final than Emma had intended. None of it had changed her mind. She had a teaching certificate and a letter of appointment and approximately $62, which seemed like a reasonable start. What she had not anticipated was that Thomas Aldridge would have died of a fever in April, 6 weeks before her arrival, and that no one had thought to send word to Connecticut because nobody in Caldwell was entirely sure who had placed the advertisement or whether the position still existed. This was explained to her by Mrs. Ruth Haverson, who ran the boarding house with the efficiency of a military quartermaster and the warmth of someone who had, at some point in her past, genuinely loved people and still retained a few of the habits. Mrs. Haverson was a wide, solid woman of about 50 with gray hair wound tight and reading spectacles pushed up on her forehead. She informed Emma of Thomas Aldridge's fate while leading her up the narrow stairs to a room overlooking the side alley, which smelled of horse and wood smoke but had good light from the east window. "So the school," Emma said, setting down her satchel and looking around the small room with its iron bed and washstand and bare plank floor. "There is a school," Mrs. Haverson said. "The building exists, Whether the town council intends to hire someone to teach in it is another matter entirely. They meet on the first Friday of each month. That is 9 days from now. And in the meantime, you have a room, and I charge $4 the week including supper. Breakfast is 50 cents extra if you want it hot. Emma sat down on the edge of the bed and did the mathematics of $62 against weekly room and board and found the numbers uncomfortable but not yet desperate. She had 9 days. She was resourceful. She had once talked a Boston shipping agent into giving her free passage on a river ferry by convincing him she was reviewing boats for a Philadelphia periodical. She could manage 9 days. "Is there anyone on the town council I should speak to before the meeting?" she asked. Mrs. Haverson looked at her with something that might have been the beginning of respect. "Mayor Dupree is approachable enough. The others follow him, but you would do well to get a few of the ranchers on your side first, because it is the ranchers who pay the taxes that pay the teachers, and Dupree knows it." "Which ranchers?" "There are several. The one with the most land and the loudest opinion is a man named Conroy. He runs the Double C about 12 miles south of town. I would not count on him being easy." She paused. "I would not count on him being anything in particular. He is not a predictable man." Emma absorbed this. "What is his first name?" Homer Conroy." She thanked Mrs. Haverson, unpacked only what she needed for the night, and lay awake for a long time listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the frontier. The creak of the boarding house settling, the distant howl of something wild, the occasional stamp of horses at the livery down the street, and the laughter from the saloons that seemed to have no intention of stopping just because the rest of the world was trying to sleep. She was not afraid. She told herself this several times with great conviction, and by the fourth repetition she almost believed it. In the morning she ate hot breakfast, because she decided that 50 cents spent on a meal that would keep her on her feet was 50 cents well spent, and then she went out to learn Caldwell. The town was noisier in daylight than she had expected. Cattle drives passing through brought hundreds of men at a stretch, drovers and trail bosses, and the assorted commerce that followed money through a wide-open country. There were a great many horses, a considerable amount of shouting, and an admirable number of dogs lying in whatever shade they could find. Emma walked the length of the main street twice, introduced herself to the proprietor of the general store, a Mr. Finn, who was sharp-eyed and friendly, bought a small notebook and 2 pencils, and found the schoolhouse. It was a single-room building about 200 feet off the main street, built of timber that was already weathering gray, with 4 windows and a small bell mounted above the door that someone had strung with a length of rope. Inside, there were 12 rough-hewn benches, a teacher's desk with one leg shimmed by a folded piece of leather, a blackboard that still had the ghost of arithmetic problems from whatever instruction had last taken place, and 2 wood stoves that would be essential when winter arrived. Emma walked the length of the room slowly, touching the back of each bench. She counted the scars in the wood, the initials carved by bored children, the dried ink stains that told her someone had at least attempted to teach reading here. She stood at the front beside the teacher's desk and looked out at the empty benches, and for the first time since stepping off the stagecoach, she felt something settle in her chest that was the opposite of the stone the yellow-grinned man had put there. She could work with this. She intended to. She was still standing there, making notes in her small book about what supplies she would need, when the door opened and a man walked in. He was tall, not unusually so but solidly constructed, the kind of height that came with broad shoulders and a long stride and did not announce itself by being ostentatious about it. He wore a plain work shirt, brown canvas trousers, and a hat with a sweat-darkened band that had seen a great many seasons. He was perhaps 30, perhaps 31 or 2, with a jaw that suggested he had opinions and hair dark enough to be almost black, sun-streaked at the temples. He had stopped just inside the doorway and was looking at Emma with an expression of frank surprise, as though he had expected the schoolhouse to be empty and was recalibrating accordingly. "I did not realize anyone was in here," he said. "I am the new teacher," Emma said. She straightened, though she was already straight. "Emma Leland. I arrived yesterday." He took off his hat, which she noted as the automatic instinct of someone who had been raised to do that, and held it against his chest. "Homer Conroy. I run the Double C south of town." He looked around the room with the proprietary interest of someone who had a financial stake in its existence. "I heard Aldridge was dead and the position was not yet filled." "It is not officially filled," Emma said. "I will be presenting my credentials to the town council on Friday week. However, I am taking the position in the interim and doing what preparation I can." He looked at her steadily. He had gray eyes, the kind of gray that was almost blue depending on the light, and they were more thoughtful than she had expected from a cattleman. "You came all the way from wherever you came from without confirmation the job was still available, Connecticut, and yes, that was either very brave or very foolish." "I find those are frequently the same thing," Emma said. Something shifted in his expression. He put his hat back on. "What do you need?" She blinked. "I beg your pardon. For the school, what does it need?" "I have been pushing the council to get a teacher in here for the better part of 2 years. Aldridge was meant to solve the problem, and now he has created a different one. I would rather have the school ready for a teacher than spend another season watching my cowhands' children learn nothing at all." He looked at her notebook. "What is on your list?" Emma looked down at the notebook, then back up at him. She had expected to have to argue for this, to persuade and negotiate and charm the council, and then the ranchers. She had not expected a cattle rancher to walk through the door and ask her what she needed as though it were the most straightforward thing in the world. "A properly made chair for the teacher's desk," she said. "Books primarily, McGuffey readers and arithmetic primers, chalk, a proper bell rope. The wood stoves need to be inspected before fall because 2 of the pipe joints look uncertain. And someone should level this floor because it slopes almost 2 inches toward the east wall, which means the students in those seats will have backache before Christmas." Homer Conroy looked at the floor, then back at her. "I can have men on the floor by end of week. The stove joints I will have looked at this week. Books and chalk I will personally purchase and bring in from Wichita next time someone makes the run." He paused. "The chair I cannot promise will be comfortable because we are not exactly overrun with cabinet makers, but it will have 4 legs of equal length." Emma was staring at him with an expression she was fairly certain was unbecomingly astonished. She closed her mouth deliberately. "Mr. Conroy, I appreciate this genuinely, but why?" "Because education matters," he said simply. "And because I have 11 children on my payroll whose fathers would be considerably more useful workers if they were not worried about their kids spending the day with nothing to do but get into trouble." He moved toward the door, settling his hat. "Also, frankly, Miss Leland, because any woman who crosses 6 states on the strength of a position that might not exist is exactly the kind of stubborn that this town needs in its school teacher." He was through the door before she could formulate a reply. She stood in the middle of the schoolroom for a long moment after he left, looking at the place where he had been standing, and then she wrote his name in her notebook with the notation, "Ally. Possible." The days that followed moved with a kind of purpose that Emma found bracing. She spent her mornings at the schoolhouse, measuring and planning and cleaning with the broom Mrs. Haverson lent her. She spent her afternoons calling on families in town, introducing herself, meeting the children who would be her students. There were 17 by her count, ranging from 6-year-old Dottie Finn, who belonged to the storekeeper and already knew her letters, to 15-year-old Jed Macomber, who had never been formally schooled and wanted desperately to learn to read, but would not admit it in company. On Thursday, 3 of Homer Conroy's ranch hands arrived at the schoolhouse with lumber and tools, and spent the better part of the day leveling the floor. They were polite, efficient men who called her ma'am and answered her questions directly, and did not appear to find anything unusual about the situation. One of them, a young man named Pete who could not have been more than 20, told her that Mr. Conroy had ridden to Wichita himself the previous day specifically to get to the books before the freight wagon made the regular run. He rode to Wichita himself, Emma said. Pete looked slightly alarmed, as though he had said something he should not have. Yes, ma'am, left before first light Wednesday, should be back tomorrow. Emma looked at the newly leveled floor and said nothing further about it. Homer came back from Wichita on Friday afternoon with 2 crates of books loaded on a pack mule. Emma was in the schoolhouse when she heard the knock at the doorframe, and she turned to find him filling the doorway again, hat in hand, looking slightly less crisp than he had the first day, which was the inevitable consequence of 2 days of hard riding. "I believe I got most of what you asked for," he said. "There were no McGuffey fourth readers left, but I found some that are equivalent." Emma crossed to where he set the crates down and began going through them. Her hands moved quickly, pulling out volumes, checking spines. McGuffey second and third readers, arithmetic primers. A geography text, a copy of Webster's blue-backed speller that looked nearly new, 2 composition books per crate, and enough chalk to last 6 months. A small dictionary, leather-bound, that was clearly not a standard school supply, but was precisely the kind of reference a teacher would reach for 20 times a day. She looked up at him. He was watching her go through the books with an expression she could not entirely read, something attentive and careful, like a man who was watching to see if he had done the right thing. "These are perfect," she said. "The dictionary was not on my list." "No," he agreed. "It was not." She set it down carefully on the teacher's desk, which now had 4 even legs courtesy of his carpenters. "Thank you, Mr. Conroy." "Homer," he said, then, as though catching himself, "if you prefer, we are not much for formality out here." "Homer, then," she said, "and I am Emma to anyone who spends money on my dictionary." He smiled. It was a quiet smile, not the broad, cheerful kind, but the kind that arrived slowly and meant it. "I will remember that standard," he said. She made him coffee on the small stove she had borrowed from Mrs. Haverson for the interim, because she felt the situation called for it, and because she wanted to keep talking to him. They sat on 2 of the student benches, which were not designed for adults and were consequently a little ridiculous, and they talked about the school and the town and the families she had met that week. He knew everyone, not in the way of a man who collected information, but in the way of someone who had been paying genuine attention to the people around him for a long time. He knew that Dottie Finn had been sick most of the previous winter and had missed whatever informal schooling had been attempted. He knew that Jed Macomber's father was embarrassed about Jed's illiteracy because it reflected, in the father's view, on the family, and that this shame made Jed's situation worse rather than better. He knew which children were quick and which were shy and which were the kind of restless that came from being intelligent and under-challenged. "You have thought about this considerably," Emma said. "I think about most things considerably," he said. "It is a habit I cannot break." She looked at him sideways. "What else do you think about considerably?" It was a forward question, and she knew it the moment she said it. He looked at her with those gray-blue eyes, and there was a beat of something between them, a small charged silence that was over before she could name it. "Land," he said. "Water rights, whether the cattle prices will hold through fall." He paused. "I think about my father's grave and whether I have done well enough by what he built." Another pause. "Other things." He did not elaborate on the other things, and Emma did not push. The council meeting was on a Friday evening in the back room of the largest saloon, which was where the town conducted its official business, because it was the biggest indoor space available. Emma dressed carefully, which meant her dark blue wool dress with the white collar and her hair properly pinned, and she carried her teaching certificate and the letter of appointment and a handwritten account of her experience and qualifications. She had not expected Homer Conroy to be there. He was not on the town council. But he was seated in the back row when she entered, his arms folded and his expression neutral, and he gave her a single nod when their eyes met, which was the most steadying thing anyone did for her that evening. Mayor Dupree was a florid man of 55 with enthusiastic white whiskers, and the political instincts of someone who had once gotten what he wanted by being agreeable to everyone, and was now so habituated to the practice that he did it even when he had actual opinions. He listened to Emma's presentation with great warmth and nodded throughout, and asked her 2 questions that were genuinely intelligent, which surprised her. The other council members were mixed in their reception. 2 were clearly in favor. 1. A man named Garfield, who owned the largest of the saloons and seemed to feel that an educated population might develop opinions he found inconvenient, was openly hostile. 1 was undecided. The vote was 3-2 in her favor. She shook Mayor Dupree's hand and said all the right things and managed to hold herself together until she was outside in the cool evening air, where she stood for a moment with her eyes closed and allowed herself to feel the full weight of what had just been accomplished. "Congratulations," Homer said. He had followed her out. He was standing a few feet away, hat in hand again, watching her with that careful attention. "I was not certain of it until the vote was announced," she admitted. "Garfield has opposed every improvement this town has attempted for the last 4 years," Homer said. "He opposed the brick paving of the sidewalk. He opposed the new well. He would have opposed the sun rising if he could have figured out how to make it a political position." Emma laughed. It came out more freely than she expected, a genuine laugh, and she put a hand over her mouth half a moment too late to stop it. Homer looked at her like the laugh was something he was filing away carefully, something worth remembering. "I want to buy you supper," he said, "to celebrate, if that is appropriate." She considered whether it was appropriate. It was 1880 in a cattle town, and she was a single woman and he was a single man, and there would be talk regardless of what she did, because there was always talk. She had decided before leaving Connecticut that she was going to live her life in such a way that the talk, when it came, was worth it. "It is appropriate," she said, "but I am buying my own supper." "You are a stubborn woman," he said. "That was established on approximately day 2 of our acquaintance," she said. He smiled again, that slow, certain smile, and offered her his arm to walk down the street to the hotel dining room, which was the only establishment in Caldwell that served meals with some degree of formality, and she took it. They talked for 2 hours over beef stew and cornbread. The dining room was not empty, and Emma was aware of people glancing at them, aware that by tomorrow this would have been seen and noted and discussed, and she found that she genuinely did not care. Homer Conroy was interesting. He had grown up in Missouri, had come west at 19 with his father to try ranching in the new territories, had lost his father to a horse accident 6 years ago, and had built the Double C from a small claim to a substantial operation through a combination of genuine knowledge about cattle and a refusal to quit that bordered on the pathological. He had been briefly engaged, 5 years ago, to a woman who had ultimately found the life too hard and gone back east. He mentioned this with the directness of someone who had made his peace with it but wanted her to understand the full shape of him. Emma appreciated the honesty. She told him about Hartford, about her father who had been a schoolmaster and had taught her that knowledge was the only truly portable wealth, about her mother who worried and her sister who disapproved, about the long train journey and the moment somewhere in Missouri when the landscape had opened up into something so vast and uncontained that she had pressed her face against the window like a child and forgotten to be tired. "You saw the prairie and you were not frightened," he said. "I was terrified," she said. "It is not the same as being frightened into stopping." He looked at her for a moment with something in his eyes that went deeper than politeness or even friendly interest. "No," he said quietly, "it is not. The school opened on the 14th of July, 1880, on a Monday morning that was already hot by 8 o'clock. Emma had been there since 6, setting out the books and writing the alphabet in careful chalk letters across the full width of the blackboard. She had arranged the benches in a slight arc rather than straight rows, which she felt was more conducive to learning, and also meant she could see every student at once. 19 children arrived. She had counted 17 in her initial survey, and the extra 2 were siblings of families she had not yet reached, A 5-year-old she judged too young but could not turn away because the mother had driven 7 miles to get her here, and a 13-year-old boy named Daniel who had the look of someone expecting to be told he did not belong. She did not turn anyone away. The morning was beautiful in its chaos. The younger ones were restless, and the older ones were self-conscious, and Jed Macomber sat in the back row with his arms crossed, daring her to make him care. She spent the first hour simply learning each child's name, which she did without writing anything down, making eye contact with each one and repeating their name back to them. By the end of the hour she had all 19. She could see several of them recalibrating her, adjusting their initial estimates upward. By noon she had Jed Macomber engaged in a reading primer and pretending he was not. By the end of the first week, she knew which of her students were ready to advance and which needed foundational work, and she had sent a note to Homer's ranch requesting that she might have a word with him when it was convenient. He came on Saturday morning, riding in on a bay horse that was neither flashy nor rough, just a sound, well-kept animal that told you something about the man who cared for it. He tied the horse to the post outside the schoolhouse and knocked on the open door. "You sent for me," he said. "I have a proposal," Emma said. She had arranged 2 adult chairs, borrowed from Mrs. Haverson, because she refused to make him sit on a student bench again. "Sit down, please." He sat, long legs extended, hat balanced on his knee, and watched her with that steady attention she was coming to expect from him. She explained. She needed more books, specifically for the advanced students who were outpacing the available materials. She needed a globe, because teaching geography from her own memory of the maps she had studied was limited. She wanted to establish a small lending library so that families could borrow books during the week, which meant she needed a proper shelf built against the north wall. And she had an idea about the children at the far-flung ranches who could not make the 7- and 12-mile rides every day, a rotating schedule of home visits, perhaps once every 2 weeks, where she would go to them. Homer listened to all of this without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "The shelf I can have built this month. The globe I do not know where to acquire, but I will write some letters. The books I will fund from the ranch account if the council will not." He stopped. "The home visits." "Yes," she said. "You cannot ride those distances alone, not safely. I was planning to learn to ride." He looked at her with an expression that was precisely halfway between admiration and alarm. "Do you not currently know how to ride?" "I have sat on a horse." "In a park?" Twice she met his eyes steadily. "I'm a quick study." He rubbed his jaw with one hand. She noticed he did this when he was working through something, pressing the tips of his fingers against the line of his jaw. "I will teach you to ride," he said. "You have a ranch to run. My foreman can manage for a few hours on the weekend. This is important." He looked at her. "The children at the far ranches matter as much as the ones in town. If you are going to ride to them, you need to be able to do it without falling off." She started to argue, caught something in his expression, and stopped. "All right," she said. "When?" "Tomorrow morning early." She was at the Double C by 7 the next morning, having borrowed a horse from the livery on Homer's account, because he had apparently arranged that before she arrived. The ranch itself struck her when she saw it for the first time. A proper working operation with a main house built of timber and adobe, a long bunkhouse, several outbuildings, corrals with their noise of horses and the smell of hay and leather, and in every direction the great rolling green of the Kansas summer stretching to the horizon under a sky of impossible blue. Homer met her at the gate. He had a patient mare already saddled, a brown and white horse named Clara who, he explained, had carried 3 previous beginners through their first lessons without expressing more than mild disdain for the whole enterprise. The lesson was 2 hours. He was a good teacher, patient and precise, and he explained things in a logical sequence: mount, seat, hands, leg pressure, rein, stop, and did not move her to the next step until the previous one was solid. He walked beside Clara for the first half hour, one hand on the bridle, watching Emma's hands and balance with the same careful attention he gave everything. "You are tensing your shoulders," he said. "Drop them. The horse knows. She dropped her shoulders. Clara moved noticeably smoother beneath her. Better, he said. He let go of the bridle. Now just you and Clara. She walked, then trotted twice around the wide corral and only once grabbed the saddle horn in a way she found embarrassing. By the end of the morning she could walk and trot reasonably well, stop reliably, and steer with some confidence. You are better at this than most beginners, Homer said, opening the corral gate for her to walk Clara out. I told you I was a quick study, she said. He laughed, and it was the first time she had heard him laugh properly. Not the quiet smile, but a full laugh, unheld. And it suited him in a way that she found she would think about later when she was back in her room at Mrs. Haverson's. The lessons continued every Sunday morning through July and into August, and somewhere in the third week, without either of them announcing it, they stopped being lessons in any formal sense and became simply time that they spent together. They would ride out after Clara and Emma were done with the corral work, taking one of the ranch's trails south along the creek that ran through Homer's land, and they would talk. They talked about everything. About the changes coming to the cattle industry, the encroaching railroads that would make the long trail drives obsolete within a generation, and what that meant for men who had built their whole lives on the drives. About the Indian territories just below the Kansas line, and the injustices that weighed on the land, the systematic dismantling of sovereign people's lives by a government that called it progress. And Homer spoke about this with a directness that told her he had thought hard about it, and had not let himself look away from what it meant. About books, because he read widely for a man who spent most of his daylight hours on horseback, and he had opinions about what he read that were worth arguing with. He lent her a copy of Dana's 2 years before the mast from his own shelf, and she lent him her own copy of George Eliot's Middlemarch, which she had carried from Hartford, and which she considered essential human reading. He read it in a week and came to her with it full of margin notes he had made on folded paper because he would not write in her book. She understands how people trap themselves, he said, about Dorothea. How you can do every right-seeming thing and still end up in a life that does not fit. Has that happened to you? Emma asked. They were sitting by the creek on a flat rock, horses tied to a cottonwood downstream. He was quiet for a moment. I have been careful not to let it, he said. I have said no to some things that would have been the easy answer. He looked at her. I do not always find it easy to know what I am saying yes to instead. There it was again, that space between them, charged and quiet, that arrived without warning and lasted exactly as long as the heartbeat before one of them looked away. Emma looked at the creek. In late August, the trouble started. It came in the form of a man named Garfield, which was not a surprise, and a letter in the Caldwell Commercial, which was the town's weekly paper, suggesting that the new schoolteacher was conducting herself in a manner unbecoming to a woman in her position, with particular reference to her habit of riding alone with Homer Conroy on Sunday mornings when decent women were in church. Emma read the letter on a Thursday and sat with it for 20 minutes before she folded it and put it in her satchel and went to teach her students, because she had a class to teach and 11 children who were waiting to hear the next chapter of the geography lesson she had been building week by week about the rivers of North America. She said nothing to Homer about it on Sunday. He brought it up himself, 3 miles down the creek trail, because he had clearly been thinking about it all week and had run out of patience with himself for not saying something sooner. I owe you an apology, he said. Emma looked at him sharply. What for? The letter in the paper. My behavior has reflected on you in a way that it should not. I have been selfish about this. He was looking straight ahead between his horse's ears, which she had learned was what he did when something cost him something to say. I enjoy your company more than I can account for reasonably, and I have been indulging that at your expense. Homer, she said, stop. He stopped the horse and looked at her. I am not a fragile thing that needs protecting from the consequences of my own choices, she said. I have read the letter. It is petty, and it is motivated by a man who opposed the school before I arrived and will oppose it after. It does not change what I choose to do with my Sundays." She looked at him steadily. "Unless you are telling me you no longer wish to spend them this way." He was quiet. The creek ran below them and the cottonwoods moved in the hot August wind, and somewhere far off a hawk made its long descending call. "I am telling you," he said, "that I wish to spend every Sunday this way until I die, and that I am not certain what to do with that." The air went very still. Emma's heart was doing something irregular. "Homer," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected, which was the Hartford upbringing asserting itself at a particularly loaded moment. "I believe you are going to have to be more direct than that." He looked at her, and something in his face that had been carefully held in place for weeks let go all at once. "I love you," he said. "I believe I have been in the process of loving you since you told me a foolish thing and a brave thing were frequently the same. I do not have a better or more complicated way to say it." Emma breathed. The prairie stretched out around them, enormous and indifferent, and somehow also the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. "That," she said, "is a very direct way to say it." "You asked for direct." "I did." She looked at him across the few feet between their horses. "Homer, I am trying to build something real here, a school that will last. A life that is mine in a way I chose. I am not looking for a rescue." "I know that," he said quietly. "I am not offering one." "What are you offering?" He thought about this seriously, which she appreciated. "I am offering to be here," he said, "alongside you, not in front of you, not instead of you, alongside." A pause. "If you want that." She looked at him for a long, clear moment. This man who had walked into her schoolroom and asked what she needed, who had ridden to Wichita himself for books, who had laughed freely beside a creek and argued about George Eliot, and taught her to ride a horse called Clara with more patience than she probably deserved, who had just told her he loved her in the plainest language she had ever heard and made it feel like the most careful and considered thing in the world. "I want that," she said. He reached across the space between their horses and took her hand, and they rode back toward the ranch that way, side by side, and said very little more because there was no need. The following months carried the weight of a life being built deliberately. Emma's school grew. By October she had 23 students, which was more than the benches could comfortably accommodate, and she wrote a formal letter to the town council requesting funds for 6 additional benches and an additional stove, because the single one currently heated only the front 2/3 of the room, and the back row was going to be miserable by November. She got the stove. The benches took 3 more letters, and Homer attending a council meeting in person and saying something to Mayor Dupree afterward that she was not present for, but which resulted in the benches being constructed within the week. "What did you say to him?" she asked. "I asked him whether he wanted Caldwell to be the kind of town that grew or the kind that shrank," Homer said. "He is a man who has political ambitions, so the answer was predictable." Emma continued the home visits, which had become one of the most important parts of her work. She rode to the outlying ranches and farms every other week, sometimes with Homer and sometimes with one of the town families who happened to be headed in the right direction, and she sat with children in kitchens and on porch steps and taught in whatever space presented itself. The Abilene girl who had never held a pencil, the Hartman boys who could cipher fast as lightning but could not read a complete sentence, the Callaway girl at the far end of the territory, 12 years old and so intelligent it made Emma's chest ache thinking of what she might become with proper resources. Homer rode with her more often than not on those days, and they fell into a comfortable rhythm of conversation and silence, the prairie rolling by on either side, the big Kansas sky doing its endless work above them. He kissed her for the first time in September, on the porch of the schoolhouse after an evening that had started as a planning meeting and become dinner at the hotel, and then a long walk back through the cooling night air. It was unhurried and careful and certain, and she understood immediately that it was exactly like everything else about him, considered and real. She kissed him back in the same spirit and then said against his shoulder, "I should mention that I intend to keep teaching after we are married if that is where this is going." She felt him go very still. "Emma," he said. "That came out in the wrong order," she acknowledged. I apologize. Are you proposing to me? I am establishing terms." He held her back a little to look at her face, and his expression was the most open she had ever seen it, a mixture of startled and delighted and deeply certain. "The terms are acceptable," he said. "All of them. I would not have it any other way." "Then yes," she said, "if that is where this is going." "It is definitely where this is going," he said, and kissed her again, and the September wind moved through the cottonwoods along the schoolhouse fence, and the distant cattle town made its nighttime sounds all around them, utterly unconcerned. Homer proposed formally a week later, on a Sunday morning by the creek, with a ring that had been his mother's, a simple gold band with a small inset garnet that caught the light the color of dark autumn leaves. He got down off his horse and then, because this seemed insufficient given the terrain, actually lowered himself to one knee in the grass on the creek bank, which she could see cost him some dignity, and which she loved him entirely for doing. "Emma Leland," he said, "you came to this frontier with a trunk and $60-some and a refusal to be deterred, and you have made this town better in every way I can account for, and probably several I cannot yet see. I would like to spend the rest of my life paying attention to the ways you make things better. Will you marry me?" She was already saying yes before he finished the sentence, and then she was helping him up because his knee had sunk into the soft creek bank, and the mud had a different opinion about when he should stand. They were both laughing as he got to his feet, and she took his face in her hands and kissed him thoroughly, and did not care at all that Clara was watching from 3 feet away with an expression of equine resignation. The wedding was in October of 1880, a Saturday, in the church with the borrowed bell, which rang clearly enough in the cool fall air that people 3 streets away knew something good was happening. Mrs. Haverson made a wedding cake. Finn the storekeeper and his wife stood up with them. Jed Macomber, who was by now reading at a level that surprised everyone including himself, sat in the 3rd row with his father, who had come reluctantly, and was blinking rather more than the occasion strictly called for. The minister read from Corinthians and said the words that had been said at thousands of weddings before and would be said at thousands more. And Homer held Emma's hands through the whole of it and looked at her in a way that made her feel she was the most fully seen person in the room, which was the precise feeling she had once thought only available to women in novels. They moved Emma into the ranch house after the wedding, which was a more involved project than it might have been because she had, in 4 months, acquired enough books and teaching materials to be technically a small educational institution in her own right. Homer built her a shelf along the whole east wall of the room they decided to make into a study, floor to ceiling, which was the most romantic thing she was certain anyone had ever done for her. The first winter at the Double C was nothing that anyone had told her to expect, by which she meant it was not the ordeal she had been forewarned about. It was hard, genuinely hard, the cold that got into everything and the isolation of bad weather weeks when the road to town became impassable, the sense of the world contracting to the distance visible from the window. But there was also Homer, whose steadiness was not the same as passivity, who had the gift of being genuinely present in a room even when neither of them was speaking. And there was the work she continued at the school through all but the very worst weeks, and there was the life they were building together, which felt new each day in small ways that accumulated into something she could not have planned. She taught through the winter, and into the spring of 1881 with 17 of her original students still enrolled and a handful of new ones. Dottie Finn had progressed so rapidly that Emma was already thinking about what she would do for the girl when she outgrew what the school could offer. Jed Macomber read everything she put in front of him and had begun asking questions about law, which she thought was probably an excellent direction for a mind like his. The Calloway girl had her parents' permission to board in town during the week, and was now the best student in the school by a significant margin. The letter from Garfield came in February, a petition to the town council signed by 11 names, arguing that Emma's presence at the school had been a social disruption, citing the original newspaper letter, and adding that her conduct in continuing to teach after marriage was setting a poor example. It requested that her appointment not be renewed for the following school year. Emma read the petition in the kitchen of the ranch house on a Tuesday morning with a cup of coffee and a face that was entirely calm. Homer read it over her shoulder and went very quiet in the way that meant he was genuinely angry rather than performatively upset. "I will go to Dupree," he said. "I will go to Dupree," Emma said. "Emma." Homer, she turned around to look at him. "I understand that you want to fix this. I understand that it makes you angry. I am also angry. But if I let you go to the mayor on my behalf, I am confirming exactly the thing Garfield is trying to say, which is that I am only here because you support me and cannot stand on my own." She put a hand on his arm. "I need to do this myself." He looked at her for a long moment. She could see the effort it cost him. "Yes," he said finally, "you are right." He paused. "Can I at least come and sit in the back like I did the first time?" She almost smiled. "Yes," she said, "you can do that." The council meeting where she addressed the petition was one of the more uncomfortable evenings Emma had experienced, and she had experienced some genuinely uncomfortable evenings in the course of getting to Caldwell. She stood before the 5 council members and spoke for 20 minutes, calmly and precisely, about enrollment numbers and reading levels, and the testimonials she had gathered in writing from 11 of the families whose children attended the school, including 2 who had initially been skeptical of having a woman in the position. She spoke about what education meant to a community that was trying to become a real place rather than just a stopping point. She spoke about the children at the far ranches who were now receiving instruction they would not otherwise have. She spoke, in the careful language of someone who had thought hard about what could be said and what could only be implied, about the idea that a woman's value to her community did not diminish because she was married, and that the children in her care were better served by a teacher who had chosen her work freely than one who was there by default. Garfield objected 3 times during her statement. Mayor Dupree gavelled him down twice, and the 3rd time simply spoke over him. The vote was 4-1 to renew her appointment. She walked out into the February night and Homer fell into step beside her and she heard him release a long breath. 4-1, he said. 4-1, she confirmed. He put his arm around her and she leaned into him for a moment, allowing herself this, the warmth of him beside her in the cold winter air, the solid fact of him. "I am very proud of you," he said quietly. "I know," she said. "I know you are." She was not pregnant yet in February, but she was by April. The news arrived with the particular certainty that allows no argument, and Emma sat with it for 2 days before she told Homer, mostly because she needed to know her own mind about it before she could speak it to anyone else. She was not frightened, exactly. She was aware that childbirth on the frontier in 1881 was a different proposition than it would have been in Hartford with its proper hospitals, and she filed this awareness in the part of her mind that held real risks to be managed rather than paralyzing fears. She told Homer on a Thursday evening after supper, sitting at the kitchen table with the last of the daylight coming through the west window. He sat very still for a moment. Then he reached across the table and took both her hands in both of his, and she could feel that his hands were not entirely steady. "Emma," he said. "Yes," she said, "I know. Are you all right?" "I am excellent," she said, which was true. "And I am going to continue teaching until September at minimum and possibly until this baby decides it is ready to arrive, so please do not suggest otherwise." He laughed a little unevenly. "I would not dare." "Good." She squeezed his hands. "Are you all right?" He thought about it seriously, which was what she loved about him, that he gave honest questions honest thought. "I am terrified," he said. "And I am happier than I have been in my entire life." "Those are both reasonable responses," she said. He came around the table and pulled her to her feet and held her, and she could feel his heart against her ear, steady and sure. The summer of 1881 was long and golden. Emma taught through June and most of July, making adjustments as needed, and the school ran through the summer partly, because she had argued successfully to the council that children in farming communities lost ground over long breaks. Homer's ranch was prospering. He had added a new foreman, a quiet, competent man named Wallace, who freed Homer from some of the grinding daily administration and allowed him to think longer about the future of the operation. He spent the extra time, when he had it, building things. He built a proper sitting room off the main house, expanded the kitchen, and added a room that would be a nursery, doing much of the work himself in the evenings. Emma would sometimes sit on the porch in the warm dusk and watch him work, and feel something so complete it was almost alarming. She had a midwife. Her name was Consuela Vega, a Mexican woman who had come to Caldwell with her husband 15 years earlier, and who was the most competent medical practitioner in a 60-mile radius, a fact that the formally trained physician in Wichita would have disputed, and that all the women on the frontier knew without dispute. Consuela was small and quick and thoroughly unimpressed by things that were not actually impressive, and Emma liked her immediately. The baby arrived in November, a boy, 8 pounds and furious about it, with a quantity of dark hair that suggested he had inherited his father's coloring, and a set of lungs that suggested he intended to be heard. They named him James Leland Conroy, James for Homer's father and Leland for Emma's. Homer held the baby for the first time with the expression of a man encountering something vast and irreducible, something that reorganized everything around it. Emma watched him from the bed, where she was exhausted and more complete than she had ever been, and thought that there were things in life that could not be prepared for adequately and only truly arrived when they arrived. James was, from the beginning, exactly like his father in temperament, deliberate and observant, deeply uninterested in doing anything hastily, and given to watching the world from his own inner quiet in a way that Emma found both familiar and entirely his own. She returned to teaching in January, which raised some eyebrows and some comments, and which she ignored with the thoroughness of long practice. Consuela's daughter-in-law Maria, a capable and warm-natured young woman of 18, came to the ranch 3 days a week to care for James, which worked beautifully, and which Mrs. Haverson privately told Emma was the most sensible arrangement she had heard of in years. The school entered its second full year with 30 students. Emma had been forced to reorganize the space, pushing the benches closer together, arranging the older students along one wall so they could work more independently while she worked with the younger ones, a method she had read about in an educational journal that had arrived in Caldwell via Mrs. Haverson's subscription, and which she had found immediately applicable. Jed Macomber had left school at the end of the previous year because he was 17 and needed to work, but he came on Saturday mornings for a private reading session that Emma refused to charge for, and he was reading the law books that Homer had ordered for him from Kansas City, with a focus that was becoming something close to professional. Garfield continued to be Garfield. He stopped Emma on the street in March and told her, with the certainty of a man who believes his opinions are facts, that she was doing her husband and child a disservice by prioritizing her career, and that the women of Caldwell would suffer in reputation by her example. Emma looked at him for a measured moment. "Mr. Garfield," she said pleasantly, "I have 29 children in my school who are learning to read and write and think. I have a husband who supports every choice I make and has never suggested otherwise. And I have a son who is being raised to understand that work done well has dignity regardless of who does it. I believe the women of Caldwell will survive my example. Good day." She walked away before he could respond. Homer heard about it from 3 different sources before she got home and told him herself. He was in the process of attempting to keep a straight face by the time she reached the part about good day. "You are magnificent," he said. "I was not particularly gracious," she said. "No," he agreed. "You were direct and precise and entirely right, which is better than gracious in most situations." He kissed her forehead. "Also, I love you extremely." "I know," she said. "I love you extremely too." James took his first steps in March, between the kitchen table and the woodbox, with the focused determination of someone completing a task, and Emma and Homer both witnessed it and looked at each other across the kitchen floor with the expression of people who have discovered something about themselves they did not entirely know before, which is how deep a thing love can go when it has room. By the spring of 1882, Caldwell was changing. The cattle trade was still running, but the railroads were extending south, and the nature of the drives was shifting, more businesslike and less romantic, the great river of longhorns that had defined the landscape for a decade beginning to thin and redirect. Homer had been watching this change coming for 2 years and had been quietly diversifying the Double C in response, adding wheat acreage on the north section, investing in a modest horse breeding program that would prove, in time, to be an excellent decision. He talked to Emma about these decisions, which some men did not do with their wives about ranch matters, but which Homer did as a matter of course because he valued her thinking, and also because he had married someone who would have found being excluded from large decisions about her own life quietly intolerable. She had opinions, good ones. She suggested the wheat decision before he had fully articulated it himself, reading the same signs he was reading and arriving at the same conclusion, by a slightly different path. She pointed out that the horse breeding program would need better quality feed storage, which led to a new barn built that fall. She was also the one who suggested they look at expanding the schoolhouse rather than trying to manage 34 students in a space designed for 12. The expansion proposal went to the council in April. This time the vote was unanimous, including Garfield, who had apparently decided that 4-to-1 margins were an efficient use of nobody's time. Emma hired an assistant teacher in September, a young woman named Clara Reed, which she found amusing given the name of Homer's lesson horse, who had come from Missouri with a teaching certificate and no illusions about frontier life, and who was, in Emma's estimation, going to be excellent. The expanded school opened in October with 2 rooms and 38 students, and Emma stood in the doorway of the second room listening to Clara Reed manage her half of the students with calm competence, and felt the deep satisfaction of something she had built becoming large enough to continue without her being present in every moment. She was expecting again by November. This time she told Homer over breakfast on a Wednesday because she had learned with James that she did not need 2 days to settle into her own mind about it first. She knew her mind. He looked up from his coffee. "Again," he said, and then, "I mean, that is, Emma." "Yes," she said. "Again. April, I believe." His smile arrived in the slow, certain way she had loved since the first time she saw it. "April," he said, "after the worst of the mud." "Always thinking practically," she said, pouring herself more coffee. "One of us has to be," he said, and caught her hand as she moved past him and pressed his lips against her knuckles, and she looked down at the top of his dark head bent over her hand and thought about the yellow-grinned man at the stagecoach who had told her the frontier would break her, and found she did not have much to say to him anymore. The second baby was a girl, born in April of 1883, smaller and quieter than James had been, with Emma's green eyes and Homer's serious expression. They named her Ruth, partly for Mrs. Haverson, who had been the first person in Caldwell to treat Emma with practical kindness, and who wept genuinely when told. James was 18 months old and deeply uncertain about Ruth for approximately 4 days, after which he appeared to decide she was acceptable and began bringing her things, toy horses and smooth stones from the yard, with the generosity of someone who has made a considered choice. Mrs. Haverson came to supper that first spring and looked around the ranch house, at the books along the study wall and the children's things by the kitchen fire and the particular way Homer touched Emma's shoulder when he moved past her, without thought, as reflexively as breathing, and said, "Well, I told you he was not a predictable man." "You told me not to count on him being easy," Emma said. "Same thing, more or less." Mrs. Haverson accepted a second slice of cake. "I was not expecting easy to mean this." Nor was I, Emma said. The school continued. Jed Macomber, at 20, passed a correspondence examination in law administered from Kansas City and was formally studying for the bar in Wichita under the patronage of a sympathetic attorney. He came back to Caldwell twice a year and sat at the kitchen table of the ranch house and talked with Homer and Emma about what he was learning, and Emma felt, watching him discuss case precedent with the same focused attention he had once brought to a reading primer in the back row, something that was probably as close to pure pride as she was capable of. Dottie Finn had been sent east to her aunt's in St. Louis for further schooling, which Emma had lobbied for with Mr. and Mrs. Finn for 2 full years before they agreed. She wrote letters back to Emma that were remarkable for someone 12 years old, full of specificity and humor and observation. The Calloway girl, Martha, had begun teaching informal lessons to the younger children on her family's ranch, which was not a formal school but was something real, and Emma wrote her a letter that she hoped gave the girl some sense of how much that mattered. Homer's horse breeding program produced its first significant sale in the summer of 1883, a string of 12 well-trained horses to the territorial cavalry at prices that made the ranch accounts comfortable in a way they had not previously been. He came home from that negotiation looking like a man who has proven something to himself, and Emma poured him a glass of the good whiskey and sat across the table and listened to the whole story with genuine interest, because she was interested and also because watching him talk about something that had gone right was one of her private pleasures. "You were right about the breed selection," he told her. "You would have gotten there yourself," she said. "Probably," he said. 6 months later. The 6 months mattered. She raised her glass. He raised his. They drank. The town of Caldwell had grown perceptibly by 1883. New families had arrived, a few new businesses, a second church for the Methodist congregation that had been meeting in someone's parlor. The brick paving that Garfield had opposed was complete along 3 blocks of the main street. There was talk of a proper library, which Emma was actively involved in organizing, and which Homer had donated the initial acquisition funds for, which she had argued about and then accepted because there were times when the right thing to do was take help from someone who had it to give and love you enough to offer it freely. Mayor Dupree, at the end of 1883, appointed Emma to the newly formed Caldwell School Board as its only educator member, which was a position that carried no salary but considerable influence over school policy across the district. She accepted it. Garfield retired from the town council in the spring of 1884. At his retirement dinner, which was a gracious and somewhat stiff affair at the hotel, he told Emma, in a tone that was the closest he appeared capable of getting to magnanimity, that she had turned out to be more useful than he had predicted. "That is an extraordinary compliment from you," she said. He looked at her suspiciously. "Is it?" "It is the best kind," she said. "It means you changed your mind based on evidence. Most people cannot do that." He was still working out whether he had been flattered or criticized when she excused herself to find Homer. Homer had been watching from across the room. "What did you say to him?" he asked. "I told him he was capable of learning," she said. "He was not sure whether to be pleased." "You are still doing it," he said. "Doing what?" "Teaching," he said, with an expression that was so warm and plainly devoted that she wanted to put her hand against his face right there in the hotel dining room. Propriety be damned. "You cannot stop, even here." "I hope not," she said. "I would not know how to be any other way." He took her hand under the table. "I would not want you to be." James was 2.5 and asking questions about everything with the methodical persistence of a small person who has decided the world is full of interesting information and intends to obtain it. He asked why the sky was blue on a Tuesday morning, and Homer, who had been trying to explain something to his foreman about fence placement, turned from the conversation and gave the question his full attention, which was the kind of father he was, the kind who did not wave off the question. "I will find out," Homer told him. "We will look it up together." They came to Emma that evening with the library copy of an encyclopedia that had arrived with the new library's first acquisition, and Homer and James sat side by side at the kitchen table, while Homer read the explanation of light scattering, aloud in small pieces that James could follow, and Emma sat in the doorway of the study watching them, and felt something she would later describe to Mrs. Haverson as a fullness so complete it left no room for anything else. She was not pregnant in the spring of 1884, and did not expect to be again immediately, and this suited her fine because Ruth was 1 and James was 2.5, and the school board had 3 significant decisions pending that required her attention. She and Homer had discussed, in the careful and honest way they discussed things that mattered, what their family might look like, and had arrived at the comfortable understanding that they would meet each development with the same honesty they brought to everything else. In the fall of 1884, Clara Reed married the owner of the new hardware store, a pleasant young man named George who was visibly overjoyed by his good fortune, and Emma attended the wedding with James on one hip and Ruth toddling at her feet, and Homer's hand warm at the small of her back, and felt, quietly and completely, that the world was as it should be. The school produced its first former student to achieve external recognition in November of that year, when Jed Macomber passed his bar examination and became, at 21 years old, one of the youngest licensed attorneys in Kansas. He wrote Emma a letter that she kept in her desk and read again several times over the following years, which said, "You made it make sense, all of it. The words on the page and the reasons to get the words off the page and into the world. I do not know what else to say except that." She wrote him back, "That is enough. That is everything." Homer found her at the study desk reading the letter for the 3rd time and asked about it. She handed it to him without speaking. He read it and handed it back, and there was a moment in which neither of them said anything at all, because some things are complete without words. By 1885, Caldwell was firmly enough established that it had begun to feel like a town with a future rather than a town in question, which was a significant shift. The cattle trade had evolved as Homer had predicted, the long drives giving way to shorter hauls as the railroads completed their southern routes, and the town's economy was diversifying accordingly. There was still wildness in it, still the particular uncontained quality of a place where the frontier's habits had not yet fully gentled into the habits of settled civilization, and Emma thought sometimes that she was glad of this, glad the place had not yet lost the feeling of genuine stakes. She had a 3rd child in August of 1885. Another boy, larger than James had been, and with Emma's coloring this time, green-eyed and copper-haired, whom they named William after nobody in particular and everyone liked immediately. Homer held him in the delivery room, which was their bedroom now that Consuela had arranged things properly, and looked at Emma with an expression that she had seen twice before and which always struck her as the most unguarded she had ever seen him. "He has your eyes," Homer said. "The jury is still out," Emma said. "Newborn eyes are not reliable evidence. They are green, Emma. They are somewhat greenish, provisionally." He laughed, sitting beside her on the bed with William against his chest, and the Kansas summer evening came through the open window, full of cricket sounds and the distant low of cattle, and James was asleep in his room, and Ruth was asleep in hers, and the house held all of them, this life they had built from Emma's refusal to be deterred and Homer's refusal to look away from what he wanted. They sat together in the quiet for a long time. "Do you know," Emma said eventually, "that a man at the stagecoach told me the very first day I arrived that the frontier would break me." Homer looked at her. "What did you say to him?" "Nothing. He walked away before I could." "What would you have said?" She thought about it. "I would have said that he was confused about what breaks things," she said. "That the frontier does not break people, it just shows them what they are made of." She looked at William in Homer's arms. "I did not know what I was made of then, not entirely." "What are you made of?" he asked. She considered this seriously the way she always considered serious things. "Stubbornness," she said. a reasonable amount of courage, an excellent education. She paused. You, she said, I am made of you now too, the way you think about things, the way you are in the world. He looked at her for a long moment. I am made of you, he said simply. I have been since you told me a brave thing and a foolish thing were frequently the same. She reached over and put her hand against his face, the way she had wanted to at the hotel dining room 2 years ago, and had restrained herself. He turned his face slightly into her hand and closed his eyes. Outside, the prairie went on in every direction. The great uncontained landscape that had once looked to her like a challenge and now looked like home. The sky going gold and then pink above the Kansas horizon. The stars beginning their emergence one by one in the deepening blue, as reliable and indifferent and beautiful as they had always been, long before anyone arrived to look at them, and long after everyone would be gone. The Double C Ranch settled into itself in the years that followed with the comfortable solidity of something that had been built, with the intention of lasting. Homer expanded the wheat operation steadily, and the horse breeding program became, by the end of the decade, the aspect of the ranch that people in the broader territory knew about. He was asked twice to sit on the county agricultural board, and refused both times because it would have taken him away from home too many weeks of the year, which was not a sacrifice he was willing to make. Emma remained on the school board for 9 years, and in the classroom for 12 before the district grew large enough to require a superintendent of schools, at which point Mayor Dupree's successor, a younger and more far-sighted man named Collins, offered her the position. She accepted, which meant she was no longer in her own classroom daily, but was now responsible for 4 schools across the district, which had grown as Caldwell grew. The first thing she did as superintendent was hire 2 more teachers, one of whom was Martha Calloway, now 18, and holding a teaching certificate obtained through a correspondence program that Emma had helped her identify and fund through a small scholarship from the school board's discretionary budget, which Emma may have allocated in a manner that Garfield, had he still been in any position of authority, would have found procedurally creative. Jed Macomber practiced law in Caldwell, which surprised everyone who had not been paying attention. He had built a small but respected practice by 1887, representing primarily the kind of clients who could not easily afford representation, which sometimes meant he was not prosperous, but consistently meant he was necessary. He had also, somewhat to everyone's astonishment, married the daughter of a local farmer, a frank-spoken young woman named Ada who thought very highly of Emma Conroy, and who told her once, at a church supper, that Jed talked about the schoolteacher who first handed him a book more than any other person in his past. He gave himself the book, Emma said. I just put it in reach, Ada smiled. That is what he says you always say. James Conroy, at 7 years old, could read at a level that put him well ahead of his grade, which Emma was careful not to make a thing about because she had seen what happened to children who were made to feel extraordinary at 7 and ordinary at 12. She taught him at home on the evenings when schoolwork was not keeping her occupied, deliberately choosing topics that interested him rather than topics that would demonstrate his gifts, and the distinction mattered. Ruth was a different kind of child, quieter and more interior, the one who watched before she spoke, who preferred drawing to reading and horses to books. Homer took her riding from the time she was 4, and by 7 she had an instinct on horseback that made his foreman Wallace shake his head with admiring bewilderment. Emma watched her daughter on horseback and thought, with great clarity, that the essential thing was not to put Ruth's talents in a category that did not fit them. William was loud and happy and persistently optimistic, which Homer said was entirely his mother's contribution. I am not optimistic, Emma said. I am practical. Emma, Homer said. Across 6 states on the possibility of a job, you are constitutionally optimistic. I had calculated the risk. You had accepted the risk. There is a difference. She considered this. Yes, she said. All right, maybe I am a little optimistic. He kissed her temple. "It is one of your better qualities." "Only one of them, one of many," he said. "I have a full inventory. It would take the rest of the evening." "We have the rest of the evening," she said. "Yes," he said, "we do." They were on the porch of the ranch house on a September evening in 1888, the children inside or in the yard, the harvest smell in the air, the first cool edge of fall just arriving in the breeze off the south pasture. The Double C was well and prospering. The school district had 4 buildings and 6 teachers, and a library that had grown from Homer's initial donation to 200 volumes. Jed Macomber was becoming the kind of lawyer who changed outcomes. Martha Calloway was becoming the kind of teacher who changed lives. Dottie Finn had written from St. Louis to say she was continuing her education and hoped to be a journalist, which Emma believed she would achieve because Dottie Finn believed she would achieve it, and that was most of what was required. James came out the kitchen door and said, "Papa, Wallace wants to know about the East Corral Gate." "Tell Wallace I will be there in 5 minutes," Homer said. "He said you would say that." "Tell Wallace he was right." James disappeared back inside. Ruth appeared at the edge of the yard, leading a small paint pony she had been working with all week, looking over her shoulder to check the pony's gait with an expression of serious evaluation that was so exactly like her father that Emma had to look away for a moment. "What are you thinking?" Homer asked. He was watching her profile. "I am thinking that I was told this place would break me," she said, "and that I have never felt anything less broken in my entire life." He put his arm around her. She leaned into him. "Not while I was standing here," he said. It was a simple thing to say, a plain thing, and it was also the truest accounting she had ever received of what their life together had been. Not a rescue, not a shelter from consequences, just his presence beside her, constant and genuine and chosen every single day. "No," she said, "not while you were standing here." The harvest came in strong that year, and the horses sold well, and the school board approved funding for a 4th classroom at the main school in time for winter enrollment. The 3 children grew as children do, in increments that were invisible day to day and astonishing in retrospect. James turned 8 and 9 and began asking questions about cattle breeding that surprised Homer's foreman. Ruth at 6 was riding independently and had started, with Emma's encouragement and a set of decent drawing pencils, to sketch the horses she loved with a delicacy of line that was striking for any age. William at 3 was talking almost constantly, and appeared to have inherited Emma's facility with language, combined with Homer's inability to be hurried into anything he was not ready for, which was an interesting combination. Jed Macomber won his first significant case in 1889, a land rights dispute that had gone against a family of exodusters, who had settled legally on a section that a powerful landowner then tried to claim through procedural maneuver. Jed found the counterargument in a combination of territorial statute and federal homestead law that took him 4 weeks to construct, and won. He came to tell Emma before he told almost anyone else, arriving at the ranch house on a Tuesday evening looking like a man who has just set down something very heavy. Emma sat him down and gave him coffee and let him tell the whole story, and when he was finished she said, "Your instinct about the federal statute was exactly right. How did you find it?" He looked at her. "I remembered that you told us in school that the federal law always sat above the territorial law," he said, "that it was like the grammar underneath the sentence. I thought there has to be a grammar underneath this." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You found it yourself, Jed." "You put the grammar in my head," he said. There was nothing she needed to say to that, so she simply poured him more coffee and let the evening be what it was. That night when the children were asleep and the house was quiet, she told Homer. He listened with the full attention she always got from him, and when she finished he said, "What does it feel like?" "Like watching something you planted grow past you," she said. "It is the best thing. You plant it and it grows and it becomes something larger than the planting." "Like children," he said. "Yes," she said, "exactly like children." He pulled her close in the dark of the bedroom, the September night cool and full of cricket sound, the ranch settling into its nighttime quiet. She could feel his breathing, steady and slow. "Homer," she said, "I am happy. I want you to know that. Not the general happiness of things going reasonably well, but the specific deep kind that I think not everyone gets." He was quiet for a moment. "I know it," he said. "I feel it in this house." A pause. "I feel it when I look at you." "Good," she said. "Good," he agreed. The stars moved over the Double C Ranch in their ancient, indifferent arc, and the Kansas prairie breathed in the dark. And inside the house, the three children slept in their rooms, and the horses stood quiet in the corrals, and the books lined the study wall, and the life continued, full and chosen and real. Exactly as real as the woman who had stepped off a stagecoach in June of 1880, with $62, and a spine like an iron rod, and the absolute refusal to be broken by anything this wide and beautiful and difficult world could put in front of her. And the man who had walked into her schoolroom and asked what she needed, and had been asking in one form or another every day since. Emma Leland Conroy, superintendent of the Caldwell District Schools, wife and mother and the most obstinate and necessary person in the county, fell asleep with her husband's arm around her and the smell of harvest in the air and no unfinished business in her heart. Everything she had come for was here. Everything she had not known she was coming for was here. The frontier had not broken her. It had instead shown her what she was made of, and what she was made of had been, all along, exactly enough.